All right, so let's journey back to the early 17th century. English poetry, at this moment, basically splits right down the middle. What you have are two incredibly powerful and really different schools of thought. They created this fundamental divide in how poetry was even written and, what it was supposed to do. So let's dive into this fascinating creative clash.
And that's a pretty compelling question, isn't it? I mean, when one single art form starts to develop two completely distinct personalities, what does that even look like? Well, in Jacobean England, it created this poetic landscape that was just defined by a clash of ideas. It was really a battle between intellectual complexity on one side and classical clarity on the other, a face-off between the mind and manners. And that's the story we're going to unpack.
Now, at the head of these two rival movements were two absolute giants of the era, John Donne and Ben Jonson. And these guys weren't just influential poets, they were the figureheads, the leaders of two opposing schools of thought. Each one of them attracted this whole circle of followers who would go on to shape the entire course of English literature.
So let's start with Donne and his crew, who we now know as the metaphysical poets. Theirs was a poetry that was really born from the intellect. It came out of all the turbulent philosophical and scientific shifts that were happening at the time. This was a school that prized the power of the mind above pretty much everything else.
The metaphysical style, well, it wasn't about smooth, easy beauty. Not at all. It was actually kind of rugged, argumentative, and just full of these intellectual fireworks. These poets, they used logic and reason to explore deeply personal things, like love and faith, almost treating a poem like a legal case to be argued, or maybe a puzzle to be solved with just pure wit.
And their signature weapon, if you will, was something called the metaphysical conceit. Now, this wasn't your simple everyday metaphor, oh no. This was an elaborate, often shocking comparison that kind of slammed together two vastly different ideas. The famous example is Donne comparing the souls of two lovers to the two legs of a drawing compass. I mean, who thinks of that, right? The whole goal was to startle the reader into a totally new way of seeing the world.
This idea of their work being an anatomy is just perfect. That word, anatomy. It brings to mind all the new scientific thinking of the era from people like Francis Bacon. Donne wasn't just, describing the world. He was dissecting it. He was taking it apart to examine the decay of old ideas and explore the very confusing existential condition of his time.
Okay, so to sum up the metaphysicals, these are the key things to look for. Their poems often sound like someone thinking out loud, right? The rhythms follow these irregular patterns of real, passionate speech. They build arguments, they use wit as a tool for discovery, and they pull imagery from all over, science, philosophy, law, to explore the huge questions of love, death, and religion.
Now, let's do a complete 180. In total contrast to Donne's intellectual chaos, we have Ben Jonson and his followers, the Cavalier poets. Their school was all about elegance, order, and classical grace.
So Jonson's followers, they proudly called themselves the Sons of Ben, and they weren't looking at the confusing present for inspiration. They were looking backward to what they saw as the order and perfection of ancient Greece and Rome. Their artistic ideals were all about clarity, balance, and control. They wanted to create poetry that was polished, sophisticated, and just beautiful. And their subject matter totally reflects this worldly, courtly focus. Cavalier poetry is just filled with themes of love, honor, and loyalty, especially loyalty to King Charles I, which is actually how they got the name Cavalier. Their guiding philosophy was often carpe diem, or seize the day, celebrating the pleasures of the here and now with a lot of wit and charm. This quote from one of Jonson's play prologues really illustrates their whole philosophy perfectly. He wanted a style that showed an image of the times, using language such as men do use. See, he wasn't interested in these obscure philosophical arguments. He wanted his art to be accessible, to be realistic, and to be grounded in a shared human experience. So now that we've met the two teams, Donne's intellectual explorers and Jonson's classical craftsmen, let's put them side by side and see how they really stack up in a direct comparison.
This table really lays out the fundamental divide, doesn't it? I mean, just look at the contrast in every single category. You've got Donne drawing inspiration from modern science, which leads to this complex, irregular, argumentative style. Then you have Jonson looking to the classics, which results in poetry that's elegant, smooth, and polished. At the end of the day, it's a conflict between intellectual passion and refined grace. So, what was the lasting impact of this sort of poetic civil war? Well, both schools ended up carving out these enduring paths for poetry, shaping literary traditions for centuries to come. Ultimately, what they did was offer future writers two fundamentally different ways to approach their art. The metaphysicals, they gave us a model for poetry as a tool for intellectual and spiritual discovery, a journey into the labyrinth of the mind. The Cavaliers, on the other hand, left behind a legacy of formal perfection, showing how poetry could achieve this incredible beauty through the clarity and discipline of classical form.
And this opposition didn't weaken English poetry. It made it so much richer. It created one of the most dynamic periods in all of literary history, and proved that there was no single right way to write a great poem.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. In our own complex, really fast-paced world, which of these two approaches feels more relevant to you? Do we connect more with the passionate, argumentative poetry of the mind? Or do we find ourselves kind of longing for that search for balance, elegance, and clarity? It's definitely a question worth pondering.